Everyone knows that Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement. He gave the famous I Have a Dream speech on the National Mall. He was killed by an assassin's bullet April 4th, 1968. Dr. King never lived an easy life, but that last year of his life was pretty difficult for him. He struggled with dissension among his own supporters, serious setbacks to his cause, and of course attacks from his enemies. Tavis Smiley is a best-selling author and public radio and TV host. He's written the story of that final year of Dr. King's life in a book called Death of a King, and he joins me in the studio. Tavis, welcome.
Mimi, good to see you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You said that you wrote this book because you think that Dr. King is misunderstood. Mm-hmm. How so?
He has been so sanitized and so sterilized over the years that the truth about who he really was, I think, is ultimately going to be irrecoverable if we don't start to change the narrative now. That is to say that King is seen, as you suggested a moment ago, as a dreamer. I think some people think Dr. King only gave one speech in his whole life, and then they think the speech only had one line in it, that I want my children to live in a nation where they'll not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's all we know from that one speech. That's 1963. King, although dead too young at the age of 39, lives 5 years after 1963. He evolves on any number of things, and the last year of his life happens to be the darkest and most difficult period of his life. And you don't get to know Mimi or Tavis or whoever you are. You don't get to know yourself until you have to traverse the difficult and dark days of your life. So if you think you know Dr. King and you don't know the journey of his last year, then you really don't know him yet.
Your book opens with an anti-Vietnam War speech Dr. King gave in New York City exactly 1 year before his assassination. Why was that speech so significant?
Significant because it was the most controversial talk that he ever gave, number one. As you intimated in your brilliant introduction, King always had pushback, but nothing like what he received the day after delivering that speech. So he gives this speech beyond Vietnam, April 4, 67. He's dead literally 1 year to the day later, April 4, 1968. So this book, the first time ever, looks at just that last year, literally, of his life. And in this speech beyond Vietnam, Dr. King calls America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Now imagine that. A black man in the 60s saying to America, you, America, are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
But why did he go there?
With a lot of people.
Why did he go there, Tavis? I mean, it's not really related to civil rights.
And there were people who complained about that. What they basically said was, Negro, we have given you license to talk about civil rights, but foreign policy is not your bailiwick. King was saying that budgets are moral documents, and they were saying, you don't tell us how to prioritize federal spending. King was saying that war is the enemy of the poor. The bombs you're dropping in Vietnam are landing in the ghettos and barrios of American cities. And they hadn't given Martin license to move outside of that lane. He was not going to be boxed in. He was against violence here. He was against violence there, as in Vietnam, and against violence everywhere.
And it was his own supporters that were telling him, don't go there, Martin, don't go there.
Not just telling him that, you're right. In his own organization, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the only organization he founded in his lifetime, his own board of directors, Mimi, voted to condemn him, essentially, for his position so publicly against the war in Vietnam. His own board of directors pushed back on him. And so he was catching hell and hate from the inside and from the outside. So the inside, he called his own team a team of wild horses. He couldn't get his team inside to support him, but on the outside, the day after that speech for the next year, everything and everybody turns on him. The media turns on him. The White House, the Johnson administration turns on him. White folk turn on him. The last poll in his life, the Harris poll, found that 75% of the American people thought he was irrelevant in the last year of his life. Almost 60% of black people, 60% of his own people, thought he was persona non grata. So everything and everybody shifts against him.
I find that so hard to believe.
I know.
Irrelevant for Martin Luther King?
I feel the same way. In the research, it is mind-boggling to read what black folks said about him, what the black press said about him, but the white liberal press, I mean, Fox News wasn't around then. We can imagine what Fox News might have said. But this is the liberal press. When you read today, almost 50 years later, Mimi, what the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine said about him, it is embarrassing, humiliating, and just shameful. And it makes you sad to read what they said about him.
So did he regret having gone there? Did he regret that speech?
Not for one moment. Did not regret it at all. Did not realize that the pushback was going to be that severe. He knew he'd get some, he knew he'd have some haters, if we can say in the common vernacular. He knew he had some haters, but he didn't know the pushback was going to be so universal and so vitriolic and so ugly. And the next day, when you read again what the press said about him, and then the black press turns on him, and then everybody else turns on him, it was a very, very difficult last mile of the way for him from 67 to 68.
So do you think that it was a bad idea in hindsight for him to be so public against the war?
Not at all. I think that you have to seek the truth and speak the truth and stand on the truth and stay with the truth. I'm constantly saying that to young people. You have to dedicate and commit your life to always being in a search for truth. You have to find the truth. Now, you understand that, you don't have a monopoly on the truth. There is the truth and there's the way to the truth. And we're always on the way to the truth. But once you seek it and you come into the knowledge of it, you seek it and then you must speak it and you stand on it and you stay with it. Now, 50 years after his death, practically, who was right? King was right. Sure. So he'd been deified in death, but we demonized him in life.
Tavis Smiley's in the studio with me. He's a best-selling author, public radio and TV host. The book is called Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King's final year. Let's talk about how he got along with other African Americans during his time. How did he get along with the more militant branch of the civil rights movement?
Dr. King was all about love. Love was a part of his DNA, part of his bloodstream. So he loved everybody, never had a hateful bone in his body. But he disagreed with the tactics of the more militant groups. He loved, for example, Stokely Carmichael. He and Stokely spoke together around the country, both opposed to the Vietnam War. Stokely came to his church in Atlanta, Ebenezer, sat on the front row, listened to him preach any number of times. So they loved each other and they were brothers. But for Dr. King, black power was a good slogan, but not a great strategy. So he disagreed on tactics, but ultimately loved these young people. And everywhere he went, from Newark to Detroit to L.A., he wanted to Cleveland. He wanted to spend time with young people to get to understand why this militancy was such a part of their DNA.
What about Malcolm X?
He and Malcolm met and, of course, had communication. He initially did not agree with Malcolm, again, on tactic and on strategy. But King gives the I Have a Dream speech in 63. By the time we get to this book, 67 to 68, the last year of his life, he's evolved on a number of things himself. Like Malcolm evolved, King evolved. So in 63, King says, I have a dream. By 67, he says that dream is now a nightmare. 63, King is fighting for integration. By 67, King says, for all that we've done for integration, I fear we've integrated into a burning house. And then here's the point that nobody can handle that you'll find in the text, but it just mind boggles people. So the guy who said, I have a dream, was going to preach a sermon on the Sunday after his assassination. He's killed on a Thursday night in Memphis. If he makes it back to Atlanta on Sunday morning, the sermon that he intended to preach was entitled, Why America May Go to Hell. That was the sermon topic. Why America May Go to Hell. Now, you tell folk the I Have a Dream guy was going to preach a sermon called Why America May Go to Hell, they don't get it. His point was that if we don't deal with what he called the triple threat of racism, poverty, and militarism, we're going to lose our democracy. And that was going to be his sermon. So he stood firm with all that hate and hell coming at him the last year. Here he was on Sunday after his assassination, had he lived, preaching a sermon called Why America May Go to Hell.
You know, in the summer of 1967, there's a lot of cities around the country having race riots, Detroit, Newark. Was the principle of nonviolence losing its appeal among African Americans?
In a word, yes. The younger generation.
Why didn't they believe in it anymore?
Well, because these cities were on fire, because young folk were being killed, because they were impatient, because they were feeling socially and politically and economically and even culturally disenfranchised. So again, Martin was all about nonviolence and peace. In the end, they wanted the same things. They wanted respect. They wanted their dignity, their humanity respected. But they had different ways of getting there. So King, again, didn't agree with their tactics, but he was being marginalized near the end of his life, marginalized by the media, by the body politic, by white folk, and certainly black people, and especially young people who just didn't quite understand this notion of nonviolence when they were butting heads with the powers that be.
So why was Dr. King so committed to nonviolence when the tide was starting to shift away from it?
Because he lived his life by a certain set of immutable principles, and those principles were not shaped or molded by the times. He made the distinction all the time between a thermostat and a thermometer. One registers the temperature, one controls the temperature. He made a distinction between those two things, but he lived his life by a set of principles, and he was consistent about that all the way through.
You know, at one point, Dr. King is really frustrated. He'd been drinking, and he screams, quote, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to go back to my little church. Had he really considered quitting?
Yes. a number of times to his
But was that just frustration or really actually
both.
considered?
Both. It depends on what day you're talking about, but both. I can't begin to describe, and the book does, I think, a good job of this, and so you have to read the book in context to get this. But it is hard to imagine what it must feel like to be the best known African American in this country, maybe even the world, and to have the media, the body politic, white folk, black folk turn on you. Your own organization doesn't support you. You're getting death threats every single day. You feel the death angel hovering in your space. You know there's a bullet out there with your name on it. You're telling your inner circle that you know your time is limited. You know that your days are numbered. And yet you got to get up every day and kind of and try to move forward. That's a lot of pressure to be under. And so when King suggested, I just want to go back to my church. This is, I've done maybe the best I can do. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Maybe it's time to do something different. He always talked about becoming maybe a college president, or doing something. Moving to England,
which I just can't imagine.
To just get away from it all for a while. I mean, I understand that pressure. I mean, I can't imagine it at that level. But in your life, in my life, sometimes you want to just get away.
He also got depressed a lot.
He did. He was hospitalized a number of times to the end of his life for what was officially regarded as or labeled as exhaustion. And to be sure, he was exhausted. As you can see from the book, he moves like the speed of sound. He's in a different city every day, trying to tell the truth, trying to organize his Poor People's Campaign, and of course lecturing and coming out against the war in Vietnam. He's on the move all the time. So surely he was exhausted, but there was some mania there. He was depressed. He was despondent. And again, when you have that much hell and hate coming at you every day, how is it possible not to feel the brunt of all of that?
We're discussing the last year of Martin Luther King's life. The book is called Death of a King, and author Tavis Smiley is in the studio with me. Dr. King used the term Negro, and African Americans at that time started to use the term Black. Is that significant?
Yes and no. I still use the term Negro sometimes if I'm trying to drive home a particular point. And sometimes you do it to get people's attention. Sometimes you do it for a laugh. The name changes that Black folk have gone through, from colored to Negro to Black to Afro-American to African-American. I've always believed, Mimi, that those name changes are in part a search for identity, a search for place, a search for inclusion, a search for self-respect. And so, I think that because the name has changed over the course of history, there can be read something into that. On the other hand, Dr. King used the term because it was the term of the day.
You mentioned his frantic pace, and frankly, just reading about it made me tired. He was just going from LA to New York to Detroit, back to Atlanta, back to... Was he doing that to keep the depression at bay, do you think?
He was doing it in part because he believed in the work that he was doing. He was doing it in part because he knew that his notion of nonviolence was starting to be less regarded by many Americans, certainly by young African Americans. He knew he was being marginalized. He knew his position on the war was unpopular. And yet again, the most beautiful part of the story, to my mind, is that every day he gets up against all the odds and continues to speak his truth. And so he's, it's an interesting juxtaposition because on the one hand, he's on the move all the time trying to tell the truth, Mimi. On the other hand, he is so unwelcome in so many places. He can't get into a Black church to preach. He can't get a book deal. He can't get a speech. They won't run his op-eds. They won't run an excerpt of his book in a magazine.
And he gets heckled.
He gets heckled when he goes to speak in certain places. I mean, this is the life that Dr. King lived in the last year of his life. None of us can imagine that, again, given how we've deified him and beatified him, as it were, in death. But he was demonized the last year of his life, but he kept moving because he knew that the courage and the conviction and the commitment, I think, born of his character, would allow him to do nothing less.
How is his relationship with his wife, Coretta?
Great relationship, but troubled. I mean, I say all the time in talking about Dr. King, Mimi, that he was a public servant, not a perfect servant. And this book does not try to hide his shortcomings and faults and frailties. Doesn't try to hide his mistakes. There's some pretty poignant sections of his conversations with Coretta about his behavior or misbehavior, as it were.
He was unfaithful to her.
Yes. So in that last year, he's wrestling with all kinds of demons, and he wants to exorcise, I think, the parts of him that are not the best. King said all the time There's some good in the worst of us. There's some evil in the best of us. So none of us are human and divine. We're just human. And so again, Martin King is an imperfect human being. But in that last year, you see him trying to confess his way through the last year, trying to purge his way through the last year. He's preaching his way every Sunday through the last year. He's praying his way. He's crying his way. But when you hear King in the last year of his life, certainly in his sermons, you can here's a guy who's trying to pull and push and pray himself through the difficult struggle he's engaged in every single day.
You mentioned in the book that he kind of used those sermons to talk to himself.
Absolutely.
And build himself back up and encourage himself.
In the last year of his life, when King is preaching every Sunday at Ebenezer, he's talking to himself as much as he is to any parishioner sitting in the pew.
Dr. King led what was supposed to be a nonviolent protest in Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
It turns violent. There's windows smashed, looting. The National Guard is called in. And he says this about himself, quote, "Martin Luther King is dead. He's finished." Is he being melodramatic?
He was not. He knew that was going to be portrayed by the press as all his fault. He knew they were going to say that his nonviolent philosophy could no longer work. He knew they were going to say that Dr. King has lost control. He has no power. They don't respect him anymore. His methodology is obsolete. He knew all that was going to happen. He says in the book to Stanley Levinson, one of his most trusted aides, everything I've just said to you now. He says to Stanley, "This is what they're going to say about me in the papers tomorrow." And sure enough, the next day he woke up and they said all of that and then some. So they'd already been on Dr. King already, as irrelevant and out of step and out of touch, and he's a communist, he's this, he's that. They'd called him everything but a child of God in the last year of his life anyway. But this incident, they used this as Exhibit A to really drill down on how irrelevant he had become.
He must have felt awful about it, given that he was there, he was leading the march. All of a sudden, chaos breaks out from his own people. These are not white people attacking.
Emotionally, he was crushed. But here's what Martin King did. When he found out who was in charge, who was involved, and who had really set this riot, aflame, they were a bunch of young black men called the Invaders. And they were upset because they had not been included in the planning and the process of bringing this march together. They had not been included. So their way of striking back and showing the old heads, as it were, that we're here and we got to be dealt with, you cannot ignore us, was to misbehave in the way that they did. They never gave any idea to the fact that Dr. King would be the one blamed for that. It would be a setback for him. But what does King do? He doesn't call them in and cuss them out. He wants to meet with them. He sits for hours, brings in food and sandwiches and cookies and cold drinks to sit and talk to these young men to understand their frustration. Throughout this book, there's so many stories, as you know, of King sitting with people to hear them out.
But does he win them over in the end?
In the end, he does. And the reason why the second march was planned is because King had won them over, had talked to them, had heard them out, told them that he loved them, and that he was going to make sure that when they did this march the second time to get it right, that they were going to be intimately involved, and indeed they were. Of course, the march never happened. Well, it happened, but it didn't happen with Dr. King because of the assassination. But he took time to win them over, just as he had done with some prostitutes in Cleveland one day.
He was driving along, and they're like essentially taunting him from outside the window, and he's like, "Stop, turn around." And he gets out and goes and talks to them.
They're calling him Uncle Tom. You're a sellout. We don't need you in Cleveland. Go back to Atlanta. They're prostitutes, but they're more down with Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement because they're young black girls. And Dr. King, tells his driver to turn the car around. The driver protested. He said, "I said, turn this car around." And eventually the driver does. Bernard Lee, Andy Young were in the car with him. He gets out of the car and he starts walking toward these prostitutes. They say, "Uh-oh." They're like, "Oh my God, it's Dr. King." He turns around, walks toward them, and engages a conversation with them. 20 minutes later, he's really late now for where he needs to be. He says to the girls, to these prostitutes, "I got to go to a meeting. At 3 o'clock, meet me at my hotel, the Sheraton." They said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Sure." 3 o'clock, you can imagine the surprise of the hotel clerk at the front desk when a bunch of prostitutes walk in and they say, "We're here, Dr. King." But he came downstairs and brought them some sandwiches and cold drinks and cookies, and for hours sat and talked to these prostitutes and tried to understand their point of view and encourage them and got them all registered to vote for Carl Stokes, who went on to become the first black mayor of Cleveland. But King would always spend time with young people. He did it in Newark. He did it in L.A. with the L.A. Watch riots. He loved young people and always wanted to engage them.
What did Dr. King mean when he said, "I've been to the mountaintop, I've seen the promised land"?
What he meant was that he could see, even though he knew that he wasn't going to get there with his people, he could see that there was a brighter day coming for African Americans in this country. I don't know that King was ever an optimist. Optimism suggests, how might I put this? Optimism suggests that there is a particular set of facts or circumstances, conditions, something you can see, feel, or touch that gives you reason to believe that things are going to get better. That was not Martin King's existence. But Martin was always a prisoner of hope. The Bible that Martin read and the Bible that I read says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So even when the evidence isn't there, even when the picture looks dark and dreary and bleak, you can always be a prisoner of hope and believing that things are going to get better because you hope that they will, and you then work toward making your hope become more optimistic. And so King was saying to them, I may not get there with you, but I have a hope that we're going to get where we need to be as a people. And that's what he was speaking about.
To live a long life, longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
He was obviously aware of all the death threats that he was getting. Did he believe it was a real possibility that he was going to get killed?
Oh, he knew it. Not just believe, he knew it.
Why?
I think part of it's because he's a prophet. King was a prophet. And in so many ways, his prophecies are, still being fulfilled to this day, or many of those prophecies we have yet to come to terms with in terms of dealing with the racism and the poverty and the military-industrial complex on steroids now in this country. But as a prophet and as a minister of the gospel, he had a connection, and I know and believe, based on what he said to people around him, that he knew that his time was limited, and that's why people focus so much on that mountaintop speech, because in that speech he basically says, as we were just discussing, I'm not going to get there with you. King said repeatedly, though, before that night, people think that speech was the night he came to this revelation that he wasn't going to make it. He knew many, many months, a couple of years prior to that his time was limited. And the epilogue of this book, and please don't read the epilogue first, it will spoil the book for you, but the epilogue in the book points out just how many years in advance he knew that he was going to be assassinated. He knew years in advance that he was going to be assassinated eventually. So this was a journey that he had to walk, and he finally got to a place very quickly where he said, indeed, on the last day of his life, hours before being killed, Martin says to some people in his hotel room, I'd rather be dead than be afraid. He has no idea in a matter of hours he's going to be dead. But he says, I'd rather be dead than to be afraid. What he says to us, though, is that you have no control over when you die, where you die, or how you die, Mimi. The one thing that we do control is what we die for, what we die for. And Martin says to me that I'd rather live for a cause than just because. You do control what you die for. Where he's laying on that floor with blood everywhere. There are all kinds of folk in the picture frame. But in many ways, for the last year of his life, Martin walked alone. As we've already discussed in this conversation, he had basically the cosmos shift against him. So when everything and everybody sort of turns against you, and you know there's a bullet out there with your name on it, your wife doesn't want to hear that. You can't tell that to your wife. You can't tell that to your closest friends. I mean, he was, but they couldn't really hear that. There's a quote on the back of this book from Andy Young. I'd like to read this if I can. Andy Young, who of course was a very close aide to Dr. King, says in this quote, "We didn't realize it, but he knew he was on his way to Jerusalem. And as much as we tried to deter him, he fought back." So the people around him knew that he was on his way to heaven. They knew he was on his way to Jerusalem. And they tried to deter him, but he kept fighting back because he knew that his time was limited. He'd made peace with that. But for the last year, Taylor Branch, one of his biographers, uses a wonderful phrase in his trilogy, America in the King Years, a phrase, frantic melancholy. That's the kind of year that Martin had the last year of his life. It was a year of frantic melancholy.
And Tavis, I know that you love Dr. King very much and have a lot of respect for him. So if you had the chance to ask him one question right now, what would it be?
That's a very good question. I've thought about that many times. I have a ready answer for you. It's a very good question, though. Since I was 12, I've dedicated my life to trying to do my small part to make the world safe for the legacy of Dr. King. I believe that legacy to be, Mimi, justice for all, service to others, and a love that liberates people. That's his legacy, and I have tried to do my part to make the world safe for that legacy. Long story short, when I was 12 years old, I was beaten brutally. I was in a hospital for 2 weeks in traction, not knowing whether I would live or how my life was going to end up. I was introduced to Dr. King through some LP recordings that were given to me as a gift by someone. I don't know why they even gave me the gift. But when I heard Dr. King talking about the power of love, he's talking to a nation, but he might as well have been talking to a broken-hearted, broken-spirited young black boy named Tavis about the power of love. And what he said to me was that, Tavis, you got to love your way through this. That hate and bitterness and revenge are not an option. You got to find a way to love your way through this. So King had long since been dead when I was 12, but he brought me back to life. He literally saved my life when I was just a 12-year-old. So this book now at 50 is my love letter to him. And so if I could see him now and ask him one question, it'd be very simply, Dr. King, with regard to trying to make the world safe for your legacy, how am I doing?
I think he'd be very pleased.
I don't know what he would say, but I'd like to think that he'd be pleased that I'm doing every little thing I can with all the platforms I've been blessed to have to try to make the world safe for his legacy. I believe that the destiny of this democracy, the future of this country indeed, is inextricably linked to how seriously we take his legacy. King was right then. He's right now, Mimi. If we don't get serious about racism and poverty, income inequality, and militarism, one day we may very well lose our democracy. We have to come to terms with that inconvenient truth sooner rather than later.
Tavis Smiley is a best-selling author and public radio and TV host. The book is Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King's final year. It's written with David Ritz. Tavis, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Mimi, for the opportunity.